Hello and welcome to Lightmap from SIFTER. My name is Gianni. Thanks for joining us on another conversation with a video game creator. My co-host on this episode is Mitch. Thanks for being part of this episode, Mitch.
Hello, thanks for having me.
On Lightmap, we explore what it actually takes to make video games and interactive media, and we talk to creative teams from all around the world. It's a guide to those interesting new gameplay experiences, and every episode you get to meet new developers, artists, musicians, researchers, and more. Our guest on this episode of Lightmap is Mark Fillon, who's the creative director of CHINATOWN Detective Agency, a nostalgic, especially for me. I've played a lot of this sort of games back in the 90s. It's a story you've got to unfold across the world as you piece together a puzzle set, partially in Singapore, but all around the world as well. Mark, thank you so much for being part of this episode.
No, folks, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to do this, especially considering that you guys are fans of the genre, fans of the inspirations behind the game.
And Mitch, you've got a bit of a personal connection to Singapore as well.
Yes, my family's from Singapore. Yeah, so I can't wait to check it out.
So let's find out first what's been making the news on the latest episode of Walkthrough. If you like insightful discussions about those high-profile games that everyone's talking about, then why not check out SIFTER's other podcast, Mainstream, in your podcast feed right now. We talk about those high-profile titles, those AAAs, some of those other smaller indie darlings, featuring insights from the award-winning SIFTER team and other special guests. You can find Mainstream in your podcast player. That's on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or head to the SIFTER website, that's sifter.com.au. Okay, Mark, can you give us a bit of an overview? What is CHINATOWN Detective Agency?
Sure. So CHINATOWN Detective Agency really is a product of, my fandom of the old Carmen Sandiego series of games. I grew up playing those games. My mom, so when I was a very young boy, we moved to Dubai. I'm from the Philippines. I was born in Manila. We moved to Dubai. My mom used to work at this company that sold Apple Macs. And one day she brought home a really, really old Macintosh. And pre-installed in that computer was the very first version of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. It was the very first non-console video game that I ever played. And it captivated me the way you needed to know real world knowledge in order to progress in the game. For folks who might not know, Carmen Sandiego requires you to do real research. The game originally came with an almanac, like a real reference book. It came in the box. So you had to figure out things like, capital cities, the currencies used in those in foreign countries, historical facts, stuff like that. As the years progressed, I had always wondered why nobody had ever used that mechanic in modern games. And CHINATOWN Detective Agency is sort of a marriage of my love for those classic point-and-click LucasArts Sierra games from the 90s and the Carmen Sandiego's unique mechanics of, having to do real-world research. So CHINATOWN Detective Agency is a neo-noir, hard-boiled detective point-and-click, but what makes it unique is you'll need to either Google, or if you still use encyclopedias and almanacs, perfect, use reference books in order to figure out answers to puzzles. And that's basically how you progress through the story.
You're bringing up a lot of memories for me because we actually had those World Book encyclopedias, and I remember when I was playing Carmen Sandiego, I'd run to the shelf and try and pull them out and find what the answer was. And they were from the 1970s, so had a whole bunch of things about like the USSR and a bunch of other stuff that was out of date now. But some of those things were still quite relevant. And I'm curious about that. Getting people to sort of leave the game or use their phone to find out more information about that. It's an interesting thing. You don't see it in a lot of games, as you said. How did you sort of balance it so that people weren't literally just Googling a whole guide and were really just searching for the information required to solve the puzzle rather than a step-by-step? Or was that not a problem for you when you were thinking about this game?
Well, it was a balancing act. First off, we knew that getting folks to do real-world research was going to be very polarizing. We set out knowing that you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And if we're going to work with a mechanic like that, let's really go with it. Let's really stick with it. So what we've done is we've created this character named Mei Ting. So Chinatown Detective Agency is set in 2037, in the year 2037, in a future world, and Mei Ting is one of the last human librarians in Singapore. And Mei Ting plays a crucial role in the mechanics of the game because if you ever get stuck, you can call Mei Ting and she'll give you a hint or the solution to the puzzle. So folks who
She's my
simply
favorite,
wanna
by the
know-
way.
She's great. She's the energy of the character was really brought on by the voice actress Kim. Made her really bubbly, very friendly. But yeah, it we know some players who will play the game for the story and they don't really want to spend too much time hitting a brick wall. So Mating is there to sort of help you along. In terms of the actual balance of difficulty, that wasn't very easy to do because we wanted to make sure that it progresses nicely so you don't get too discouraged in the first few levels. In the first few missions, it's relatively easy information to find online. But later on, without spoiling too much, things get a little bit more challenging. You're going to have to research very ancient languages. You're going to have to know certain encoding and decoding, cryptography stuff. So I think it progresses very gradually and kind of lets you warm up to the mechanics of the game before throwing the big puzzles your way.
I wanted to ask you about the setting of the game. It's set in Singapore, and that's not usually a place that we go to in our games. Can you tell me why you decided to set the game there?
Sure. So I've been living in it's 7 years now. I've been living in Singapore for 7 years now. And the first thing that struck me about living in Singapore is this would make a really good setting for a Black Mirror episode. It's incredibly it's very futuristic. It's very advanced. Things run very smoothly, but the human interaction with that order and technology and strict laws kind of lends itself to really cool. The oft used word is dystopian, right? It lends itself to a lot of that dystopian storytelling. I thought setting a hard-boiled futuristic story in Singapore would be perfect. In fact, during the development of Chinatown Detective Agency, they shot one of the seasons of Westworld here, which was a perfect place to shoot something like Westworld. The city's got a lot of history underneath all of this modern glitz. It takes very good care of preserving that history. And as you know, Chinatown Detective Agency, depends a lot on things like history and art and just general trivia. So it was a perfect setting for Chinatown Detective Agency, we thought at least, and at least we think that it panned out pretty well.
I felt while playing the game there is a tension in this of modern Singapore with the government and big business, and it felt like it had sort of been extended out into a future world where some of those systems that we rely upon aren't at the same standard that they'd be expected today. Even the MRTs, for example, right? The MRTs are graffitied and they're covered in all sorts of scratches and broken things. And if you went to Singapore today, you wouldn't see that happening. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of exploring a bit of the cultural context of Singapore as a place as you sort of develop this science fiction version of a city just in the not too far future?
Sure, absolutely. It was a lot of fun doing that. It was a lot of fun imagining Singapore in a future world where government the coffers have run dry, government services are failing, things are just kind of on the brink of chaos. It was a lot of fun imagining a world like that because it is so far removed from what Singapore is today. It's a well-oiled machine. So thinking about things like what would happen tomorrow if Singapore's police force had 1/10 of its budget? Like what would happen to law and order? What would happen to its transportation system if it was privatized by mega corporations? So a lot of the world you see in a lot of Singapore, beg your pardon, a lot of Singapore that you see in Chinatown Detective Agency is almost like the complete opposite, the complete extreme of what it is today. And it's sort of reflected in the attitudes of the people you meet in the game. A lot of the people have a very, pessimistic outlook. A lot of people have a very dark, greedy, I'm only out for myself kind of perspective, which pretty much runs contrary to that, cliched perspective of the collectivist, the collectivist Asian culture, which to a relatively high degree is very much true, especially in places like Southeast Asia. So exploring those themes of the relationship between the people and technology, the people and their government, was a lot of fun to do.
There are also, one of the things I noticed as well, the places that you visit often have layers of colonialism in them as well. Even when you go in the early missions, you're visiting places like Istanbul, which was a French colony at one point, and all of these different pieces. And you're talking about Beirut, which was part of French colonies, and layers upon layers on that. Can you tell me a bit about how a place like Singapore, which of course used to be part of the British Empire and is now its own country. Talk about how those layers of history sort of shaped the story you wanted to tell.
I think it did to a very large degree. I think it was for all intents and purposes intentional. At least in our minds, especially the writing team, we wanted to tell a story of the effect of colonialism on history, the effect of colonialism on countries and their people. Not so outwardly, but at least in hints of the world building. One of the things that I really liked, and Rick Godwin, our narrative director, helped me write this, was in one of the story arcs, because fortunes have sort of changed. The tables have turned. In the world we imagine, East Asia is sort of leading economic power, whereas mainland Europe has sort of stagnated through the years through a combination of things like political unrest and the ongoing pandemic. So one of the main themes of one of the story arcs is that Europe is running out of artifacts because private buyers from Asia keep buying things like their paintings, their the works that defined periods like the Renaissance are all being siphoned out of Europe and into the hands of private collectors in Asia, which is a parallel to what happened during the colonial era, when a lot of the treasures and artifacts in places like Africa, East Asia, even the Indian subcontinent, South America for sure, would be taken back to Europe to be displayed in these grand, beautiful museums like the British Museum. So we thought that was a lot of fun to do, because it's drawing this parallel reality in the future of that happening, but with the tables turned, felt like a really great way to show the impact of colonialism, even economic colonialism, on the world around us. So what we also did was, in every location, in every city you can travel to, there's a little information icon on the top right that you can click on, and it'll show you a little bit of the history of the city and a short timeline. So, in the 19th century, this is what happened to Paris. In 2000 and something, this is what happened to San Francisco. And then we put in fictional future events that take place in the later 2020s and 2030s, that again sort of play around with that location's history a little bit. So it was a lot of fun to do that. Just the world building process was probably the most enjoyable aspect of making Chinatown.
Can you tell me a little bit about the art style as well? Because there's that rooted in the history of the place of where it is, but it's obviously got those futuristic bits woven into it as well. Was it as simple as just slapping a bunch of neon on everything and kind of getting to the future? Is that how it worked? Or what were the considerations about designing a world that felt real?
Well, slapping on that neon veneer was definitely important. But that's all the work of Ricardo Yuham, our art director, based out of Brazil. Brilliant artist. He works with pixel art exclusively. Well, not exclusively, but at least in his involvement in the video games industry, he's known as a pixel artist. And each one of those locations, each one of those scenes was was basically handcrafted, and he would use a combination of references. Sometimes he would use photographs that I provide him because, we live on opposite sides of the world. So I take pictures of Singapore, send it to him. Sometimes he'd use Google Street View. And sometimes I believe there was one city that he made. I think it was Delhi, or I can't remember. It was one of the cities. He was able to get a good perspective, a good view of it, a good angle of it by playing Flight Simulator. So he flew a plane in Flight Simulator over the city, took the snapshots he wanted, and then that was his reference for that place. And it's done pixel by pixel. It takes a lot of time to create one scene. And what you'll also notice is some cities will reflect their current economic conditions. So again, we imagine some cities like, say, London or Boston will show a little bit of a derelict side. Some buildings will be dilapidated. There's visual poverty, visually apparent poverty in the foreground. Again, as a reflection of the current state, to make it believable that that this is the year 2037 and this is the new reality that Amira, the main character, is living in.
You touched briefly upon the voice acting of the game earlier, and one of the main comments I keep reading is, "Oh my god, there is a legit, authentic Singaporean accent in like the first 2 minutes of the game." Can you tell me a bit more about your choice of voice actors and the choice to actually have voice acting?
Oh, gladly. So it was non-negotiable to have actors from countries where the fictional characters were originally from.
Hey, brought you a little gift.
I don't drink, Justin.
Oh, keep it in a cool, dark place and away from reach of children. Who knows, might be worth something one day when we finally run out of wine.
So all of the Singaporean characters are voiced either by Singaporeans or Malaysians. The Japanese characters voiced by a Japanese actor. The Russian characters voiced by a Russian actor. So we wanted to make sure it was authentic as possible. Oh, and Letitia, an Australian character, is voiced by an Australian VA artist. So we wanted to make sure that was authentic because it's almost at a meme level, at least for gamers in Asia, how badly Asian characters are voiced sometimes. I don't know if you remember, Mitch, but Bolo Santosi is like the gold standard of this of this really badly acted Asian video game character. So we wanted to make sure that the actors and actresses that played these characters were from that place, and also we like to use colloquial language a little bit. So you'll hear a little bit of Singlish, you'll hear a little bit of Malay. Even the Russian character will swear in Russian. Those nuances can only be captured if your VA knows what they're knows how to deliver that line accurately.
It was something really good to hear because you hear the variety of different accents of a place as well. Like Superintendent Ko speaks with a Singaporean accent, but has a different accent to Rupert, for example, both Singaporean characters talking about like that. So, and I found as well, when you hear Letitia, who is Australian in that, you hear an Australian accent that sounds more like you'd hear on the streets in Australia versus than what you'd see in TV and film, because quite often it's very over the top. It's very Steve Irwin, Crocodile Hunter, and Letitia doesn't sound like that. She sounds like someone who's been to university and runs a company, and that sort of makes sense for the character of who it is. Can you tell me, are there some other examples you've got of places or telling the story that where authenticity was really important to you outside of those examples that we've kind of touched on?
Sure. It's in the missions themselves sometimes. So one of the story arcs involves a mega church, and Asia in general is notorious when it comes to their relationship with the mega church, with these large institutions, and I hate to say it, but a lot of them are for profit religious spiritual institutions. So that story arc was sort of inspired by things we see not just here in Singapore, but they're big in places like the Philippines and South Korea, and all these other locations in Asia as well. So that story arc is based on a scandal that happened in Singapore concerning a megachurch. And
You know, it's really funny. I think I know what you're talking about, but yeah, go on.
yeah, I think you do, Mitch. I mean, so it involved a very large megachurch using its funds for things that are obviously inappropriate. That was sort of the inspiration for this story arc as well, is that there's this megachurch that was wielding its power in very inappropriate ways. And it speaks so much to an Asian gamer because they see it every day. A lot of these institutions are so mired in scandal that seeing it in a video game is sort of like, that's just the way, that's just the way Asian society is sometimes. So even in the structure and plot of the missions of the story arcs, you will see a slice of life of Asia in there somewhere in the little details.
The game itself feels both nostalgic but modern as well. And I'm curious, there are some parts of the way that it's designed which really feels like it's taken straight from the 90s. Can you tell me about that sort of balance between having something that feels like those old school games that we would have played, but also modernizing it for an audience that would be playing it instead on a controller, which, a lot of people might be playing it on Game Pass, for example, versus, the keyboard and mouse we'd be familiar with?
Right, for sure. I mean, and I think, I think you'll notice this, Gianni. The UI is straight out of Carmen Sandiego, for one thing, because the UI just kind of is instantly recognizable. So we thought that was a nice homage, to those classic Carmen Sandiego games. Old school point and click adventure games from the 90s are known for their clunky UI. Like most of the time, the UI will take up just so much real estate, and we wanted to embrace that. We felt that there's a way to do that tastefully without serving as an obstacle to the enjoyment of the game. Things like the UI, things like your staples of point and click, where you need to click every single space within the screen to make sure you didn't miss out on an object. These are all things we remember doing, and we wanted to make sure that it felt like this is something LucasArts would have done. But at the same time, we were very conscious of the way games are played these days. At least in the PC version, there's a button in the bottom panel that opens up a web browser immediately, so you don't need to Alt-Tab out of the game. You simply, press that button, brings up your web browser, so you can do your search, you can do your research. Even for the console versions, so we worked with a porting team called Knights of Unity, who've done just a heroic job of porting it to a controller-based platform. Point and clicks are notoriously difficult to play on a controller, but somehow they've done it. And because it's so dependent on UI, bringing up windows, bringing up, like your inbox, pressing buttons and bringing up different interfaces. Fitting that all into a controller was a real challenge. And we went through several iterations of different combinations of key mapping, of mapping it to the buttons on the controller, until we eventually found, just a sweet spot where it worked quite well. In all honesty, I still think point and click games should exclusively be played on the PC. That's just a personal belief. But making sure that it was accessible to a larger group of players was very important to us. So when somebody said, can you port it to Xbox or to Nintendo Switch, it took a few days of soul searching, but we eventually said, you know what, if it means more people are playing it.
I'm just curious, the game's out, people are playing it now. What is the thing that you're most proud of in this game that you look at and just go, that's excellent work, I'm so glad we put that in this game?
Gosh, there's so many things I'm happy about, from the praise of the writing and the art to just folks like literally spending some of the reviewers we've encountered on Steam have been playing the game for 27 hours. But I think the one thing that I'm really proud of that's very weird is that it sort of changed Google auto detect, autocomplete. So I don't want to spoil it, but there's this one puzzle and the answer to that puzzle involves a series of numbers. And if you type those series of numbers on Google, if you type in enough numbers, the first auto-predicted result is the answer to that puzzle. So the game has literally changed the way Google works in its own little way. And I'm really proud of that because, we never imagined people would embrace something like this. It's certainly polarizing. A few folks have found it incredibly tough to deal with. Some folks simply don't like it, but you got to do something brave. We set out to do something bold. We set out to kind of reinvent the genre, and not necessarily please everyone. And we're quite happy with the end result.
Kids these days don't know how good they've got it, do they, Mark? Back in the day, you had to struggling to play these games.
Absolutely.
Are you a little worried, Mark, that possibly in the future this game will become a bit too easy because of that modifying of the algorithm?
That's a great question. So by now, if you start Googling that stuff, they'll just show results of walkthroughs. And I suppose we never really put a lot of thought into it. It's hard to predict. It was very hard to predict exactly how it would affect the algorithms, how it would affect your Google search results. But it's my personal belief that if a person was really into the game, if the person was really immersed and they really wanted to experience the game, they'd skip that. They'd go straight to their Wikipedia page, or they'd filter out the results that would, straight up give them the answer. And that's the hope. And we're completely okay with that.
It's called CHINATOWN Detective Agency. It's out now. You can play it on Game Pass, or you can pick it up on Steam. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Light Map. It's been a real pleasure to hear a bit about the intention behind this game.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for having me.
SIFTER is produced by Nicholas Kennedy, Fiona Bartholomaeus, Daniel Ang and Adam Christou. Mitch Lowe is our senior producer. Thanks for being part of this episode, Mitch.
No worries. Always happy to be here.
And my name is Giovanni. I'm the executive producer. Thanks to Omny Studio for their support of SIFTER's 3 podcasts. You can find links to the games that we've talked about on our website. That website is sifter.com.au, and read more about the games and the guests that we've featured in the show notes as well of this episode.
You can also join the SIFTER community. It's a Discord server. That's sifter.com.au/Discord. It's where we share our creative work. You can talk about video games, talk about what you're doing, or just, have a chat to other people who are interested in indie games and gaming. And also, could you please share the show? It's the number one free thing you can do to support us. The word of mouth is really important to indie podcasts like this one, so let your friends know if you think they'll enjoy it, and send them a link. Make it easy for them to take part in the show, and we'll love you forever for it.
That's all for now. Thanks for joining us again, Mark.
Thanks so much, guys. It was really enjoyable.
And see you on the very next episode of Light Map.
Bye.